If I think of, for example, Velázquez's beautiful painting of the crucifixion, it just has Christ on the cross. It was painted in the 17th century. If we look at that, over time, we may change our opinion about it, because the very nature of beauty is that it is, as you said, invitational and confrontational.
Greetings, my name is Margarita Mooney Clayton. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Practical Theology at the Princeton Theological Seminary. I'm also the founder and executive director of Scala Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to restoring American culture through beauty, liberal arts education, and liturgy. I'm pleased to join you today from the studios of Princeton Theological Seminary here in Princeton, New Jersey, with David Clayton to talk about a book he's working on about how beauty can transform American culture. David is the provost of Pontifex University, an online Catholic graduate program which offers degrees in sacred art, education, and theology. David is also an artist whose commissions hang in churches both in his native England as well as here in the United States. In addition to being an artist and a professor, he's a prolific author. So I'm here today to talk to him about his latest book project, which I mentioned is called The Transformation of American Culture. In fact, I talk to David about his book all the time because, as you may have noticed, we have the same last name. We were married in 2022, and from the first time I met David and all the way through every single day of our life together, we discussed these themes: beauty, culture, education. These are the recurring themes that we both really care about. So for today, I wanted to share with you the kinds of conversations that my husband David and I have all the time. Conversations that have spilled out into my teaching at Princeton Theological Seminary, where David has been a guest lecturer in my classes on devotion to Mary, where he explains the history of iconographic images of Mary, talks about the icon of Guadalupe. David has also been a speaker at numerous Scala conferences on art, the sacred, and the common good. He is Scala's artist in residence and has brought to Scala a whole community of artists who care about connecting the work that they do as artists to the greater good and the glory of God. Welcome, David.
Very nice to be here.
Well, the first question that I want you to share with our listeners is, given all the things that you do, right? You make art, you teach classes about sacred art, and you give lectures. Why was it important to you to write a book about transforming American culture? And how does this book you're working on now grow out of your previous books, which are actually quite numerous? One is called The Way of Beauty. Mm-hmm. One is called The Vision for You. Yeah. One is called The Little Oratory, which is about how to decorate your home with sacred art. So you've already written several books. What was left to say, and why did you decide to write this why was it important to you to write this book?
Well, firstly, my ideas have developed since I wrote those other books, but if I was to characterize what I've done, it swings between a very personal engagement with art. That's in The Little Oratory, which is about prayer in the home. So that's for those who use sacred art. And then The Way of Beauty is about how you would incorporate a formation of beauty into education, really at the university level. And I'm relating a lot to my own experience there, and outlining some of the theories of art and culture. What this book does is try to give a popularizing version of that, but also one that inspires people particularly to focus on the transformation of American culture. So it goes further than simply formation and education, although it includes a lot of reference to that. In many ways it's shall we say, deepening themes that I've written elsewhere. But it really is directing that towards the wider vision of evangelizing the culture. Now, why American culture? Well, I live in America. I've recently become American. even though I have this English accent, which I've retained from my youth, shall we say. But also, very seriously, I think that America is still the leader in the West. I believe there is an attack on the West and Western values, which are really, I would say, Christian values. And I want to see those restored, and I'd like to see it focus particularly on America as the leader of the world.
Wow, that is a pretty lofty ambition there. But what I want to try to do today is convince people in a way that it's worth it to go on this journey with you and think about American culture and transforming it. And what I think is unique about this book is that I'm a sociologist. We write about culture, right? I did my PhD in culture. No, I did my PhD in sociology, pardon me. I took classes on sociology of culture. I studied kind of, movements and art history. But I haven't encountered too many people who make culture, people who make the art of culture, who are thinking about the connection between their art form and the broader culture.
Yes.
So that's what I think part of what makes your voice unique. Although once you say it, it's kind of obvious that paintings and music are part of culture. I think there's a way in which oftentimes people think about American culture as a shared set of ideas, a shared set of principles. And what I actually hear you saying, and I have to say, this is a little bit of a controversial point. What I actually hear you saying is that culture is not just the way we think or the principles of the Constitution, as important as that is. That culture is actually an ordered pattern of activity that art and music have a fundamental place to play. So there's kind of a shared tradition of culture and art and beauty. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. So the way I define culture is that it's an emergent, and I'll explain that term in a second, emergent pattern or order that we can see when we look at human behavior and the pattern of human activity for a particular society. And so it's very difficult to see it if you look at one person in a society. If I look at a single American, I don't know whether what I'm looking at in terms of their behavior and their taste and the art they choose, anything they do, is distinctly them or is in common with other Americans. I can't discern that until I look at American society as a whole. And it's something that very often is difficult to define precisely, but we discern it. I would say coming from England and looking at America, there's far more that unites, shall we say, Louisiana and Washington State than many Americans care to admit to, especially people from those two states. They like to think of themselves as distinct. But as an outsider, I'd say there's much that unites people, and it's the pattern of behavior. Now, the product of that behavior is the product of human creativity in any sphere. So, yes, art and music and the things we think of as high culture, but right down to the design of plates I always think of the street furniture. The road signs are distinctly American. And when you come from Britain, you notice how the colour schemes are different, the way that streets are, the street names are put onto the streets is very characteristic of America. Now, you may say, why do I want to say that? Well, what I'm thinking of is that if you look at the broad picture, you can discern and detect that it reflects the core priorities, beliefs, and practices of that society. Sometimes it's very obvious, sometimes we can't see it directly, but you get a sense of the nation, shall we say, and the people within it collectively by looking at that pattern of behavior and then also the things that they make and do.
Well, we're going to talk more about this, but as you were speaking, I think what resonated with me was that a few times I've traveled to countries where I don't know anything in the language. I can't understand it and I can't read it. And when you're in an environment like that, what do? You essentially try to read the environment, right? how do I find my way out of this building? What do the exit signs look like? How do I find my way to the important things inside of the building, like the bathrooms, right? And it is kind of incredible that I've been on these trips to places where I don't speak anything of the language, and I've managed to figure out how to get things done to a certain extent. So I think, of course, understanding the language would help. But your point that there is a built environment around us that is communicating something, and it's communicating a kind of social order, I think should resonate with anyone who's ever been in an environment where they don't understand anything of the language. You can still understand what's going on. But I guess this seems to me like quite a journey, right? You really are. Tell me a little bit of your journey just to help listeners understand. I mean, here you are. We've already said you weren't born in America. You're very recently an American citizen, in fact. Why did you, this seems to be talking about the common good and culture, but really, how does this connect to your vocation to paint? I mean, you're a painter. You're an artist.
Yes. So, and in the book, I talk a lot about that. But what I'm focusing on in this book, which I think is unique, as far as I'm aware anyway, in the way that I treat it, is that if we're going to transform the culture, this isn't really a question of imposing laws and ways of regulating human behavior so it looks like what I would like to see. What it is about giving people freedom so that they can exercise their love of God. And then what happens is that they create a pattern, they contribute to that pattern creatively that will reflect, if they love God, a beauty that actually reflects the beauty of God, because it's harmonized with their love of God. And so I would do that in part as an artist. I paint and I hope that it reflects those values. That's for others to decide, but that's what I'm trying to do. And I talk about the creativity of the artist and explain how ideas are manifested into art in practice to demonstrate that link between the first formulated idea and then the incarnation of the idea as an artist. But then what I try to do is connect that passage of logic, if you like, from idea to artifact, and say that if you can stimulate that creative instinct in people, and it's there in all of us, we're all called to be creative in some way and contribute to God's plan, then each of us in everything we do, whether it's mundane or noble, shall we say, or elevated, in some way is contributing to the beauty of the culture. And it can be in very surprising ways. I focus on the training and the methods of art because I think that this is a way of introducing to people a way of getting in touch with that creative impulse. So even those who aren't meant to be artists, if they can actually experience creativity in the visual arts, for example, and I focus on that because I'm a visual artist, what you're doing is stimulating that creative impulse. If then you help people to understand how God is calling them personally to be creative, then they can apply that instinct in that particular area. And so it could be something like being a research scientist or an entrepreneur, but this can work at very ordinary levels, being a mother, being a father. Just doing an ordinary 9-to-5 job that may not look that exciting to people around, to others, can be done creatively in that sense, and it's inspired by God. The important thing is not only the result, that you're creating things that are beautiful and graceful, one hopes literally graceful in that God is inspiring it, but also if that is the pattern, it is more joyful. This is the source of human happiness in living out our lives as Christians in the world.
Okay, so what I think I've heard you say, now I want to dive into some of the meat of the book, some of the controversial questions, but what I think I'm hearing you saying is that you've written this book with a pretty big objective, which is to share your thinking about art and culture and creativity with people who may not think of themselves as artists, but care about culture and care enough about beauty to learn a little bit of what goes into the craft of making art, but that the ultimate goal is to stimulate all kinds of creativity.
Yes.
But what I do think, so the book is kind of split. I've had the privilege of reading this and discussing with you. And so the book is split into this kind of larger, big picture discussion about creativity and culture and this kind of bottom-up vision of culture where everybody's a creator or a co-creator with God. And then you get into the meat of the book. One piece of the meat of the book is very specific discussions about the form and craft of different kinds of art. But you also have sections where you talk about, I think, some controversial questions. And so I wanted to ask you some of these controversial questions, or at least, conversations that could stimulate debate, right? And one of the common things that people say, you actually have a blog, I think, by this title, when people say is like, look, I care about all these topics, but beauty is expensive, right? So is it really worth it to create beauty? Like, why do you think it's important to create beauty? I mean, I guess you've sort of already answered that question. But how about, is it expensive to create beautiful things?
No. If you're creative, then part of that creativity is working with the materials that God's provide. So you need to be creative in economizing, I would say. But it really isn't. It's not about adorning things superficially, shall we say, with expensive materials. It's getting down to the core design principle. And that comes from understanding the nature of beauty. So if I think of the architecture of a building, the main thing that actually governs whether or not it's beautiful or ugly, in my eyes, shall we say, are the proportions, the dimensions of the building and how the size of the windows relate to each other and to the doors and to the overall dimensions of the building. And it's far more that than shall we say, embellishments in design. All of these things count, but the mathematical description of the proportions is the most important, I would say, and then that it's suited to what it is. And that's just a question of changing the dimensions. It's as cheap or expensive to make things in an ugly way as it is in a beautiful way. The one difference, perhaps, is if you're relying, for example, on mass-produced component parts, you may need then to try and influence that. That might restrict you in some way. But even then, these things can be used creatively, put together in a creative way, so that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, so to speak. That the whole can be beautiful, even if the component parts are not what we would choose first and foremost, and that they're all we can get hold of.
So on this question of kind of beauty and proportions, would you say that a city or a state capital like Annapolis, I'm from Maryland,
yes,
has buildings that are kind of in this Georgian colonial style that have these proportions? I mean, could you describe some of those buildings, and do they fit what you're saying about the mathematical proportions?
Yes, I can. And Annapolis is a great example. It's a town that I've visited myself. I think I even did a feature on it in my blog, actually. The Capitol building and the centre of the town is beautiful. And what you have there is things in a neoclassical style. So it has columns and porticos that ultimately reach back to ancient Rome. So those things aren't about proportion. They are the embellishments, and they're important. They're consistent with a vision that those who created those buildings wanted to portray of reason and justice, and it evokes that when you see it. But if you look at, for example, one way to characterize this, the dimensions of the building, very often they make it visible in the different sizes of the windows in the buildings. And if you think of a beautiful chord, those who know anything about musical theory will realize that in order to have a chord, you need 3 notes to have the fullest expression of the chord. And those 3 notes have to work well together. They're consonant. In other words, they sound well together. And you can't pick any 3 notes randomly. There are an infinite variety actually of notes, but nevertheless, it's not all combinations. And so you pick notes in a chord that sound well together. How do we decide what sounds good together? The answer is just human consensus, that most people hear these three notes and they hear harmony. We can't explain why that is, but that's the starting point. People hear the chord and they find it beautiful. Now, you can then convert those three notes into mathematical equivalents, because every note has a wavelength, or there's a length of a piece of pipe, shall we say, an organ pipe that produces that note, and you can compare those lengths, and you can then convert them into proportions in a building. And what you're doing is embedding musical theory into the proportions of the building. This was the logic that was used by all architects, shall we say, certainly prior to up to including the 19th century, and by most prior to the Second World War. And if you look at the buildings in Annapolis, they have different size windows as you go up the stories. And the grandest buildings will have 3 stories, and therefore 3 different sized stories. And they are, in fact, a chord in concrete and brick. And they work well together. One, I would say, because they reflect the same mathematical principles of music theory, or the same mathematical dimensions. But ultimately, the test is the same as it is with music. When most people look at it, do they find it beautiful? And I would say that one test of that is that when people go to Annapolis, they probably go and visit those buildings in the centre because they're beautiful. And the reason that the town has societies, we met somebody who's involved in preserving those buildings to keep Annapolis beautiful. Why is that? Does that society exist? Because the perception is that those buildings are beautiful, and people who live in Annapolis want to preserve them. They like to be there when it's beautiful.
Mm. You know, one of the common questions I get when I start talking about beauty, and mostly in the context of sacred art, because that's what I've been working on lately, is that's just relevant, to people who already care about sacred art. How would you make this relevant to engineers or scientists? And what I often will say, now having read your book, The Way of Beauty, and this one on the transformation of American culture, is I simply began to talk about these proportions and these harmonies, and tell them, for example, of a trip I went on to Italy, which was with the Department of Engineering at Princeton University, which was on engineering and beauty. That engineers care about function, but they also care about the aesthetic appeal of what they're building. And so the aesthetic appeal of the buildings in Annapolis that you're talking about, it just strikes you very differently than when you're looking, for example, at a jail, or frankly at many modern housing projects, right? Which, if you imagine some of the American housing projects, like the famous ones that were torn down in Chicago, they were monochrome, the windows were all the same. And that kind of building actually reflects that human beings are purely material. Yes. And what you're saying, and what I think scientists and engineers can recognize, is that the human person is created to perceive form, and that form has an influence on the soul. So what I wanted to say, kind of to draw you out a little bit on that, when I often remind people, although I introduced you as provost of Pontifex and an artist, I skipped over that your formal degrees are actually in mathematics, physics, material science, and metallurgical engineering from Oxford, and of all places, Michigan Tech. No slight to people from Michigan, but how does a kid from Cheshire end up in Houghton, Michigan? I don't know. But did I get that right, that your actual degrees from Oxford and Michigan Tech are in math and physics and engineering?
Yeah, so the subjects were material science and metallurgy at Oxford, so that's the physics of solid, which clearly engages a lot of mathematics. And then my master's was in metallurgical engineering from the great Michigan Tech. I enjoyed my time there, for those from Michigan who are listening. But that is the case. And I use that education, that formation I had, in my art as well.
How?
Directly. By understanding and approaching things mathematically. So if you think of music as the equivalent, and I always go to music because it's the one area in the arts where the old theories, if you like, are still taught. And that is the theories of harmony and then counterpoint, and the things that allow a composer, shall we say, to create a beautiful piece of music. Now, you can teach somebody how to use harmony and how to use counterpoint, but that doesn't make somebody a good composer. They still need that inspiration on how to do it. A melody comes through inspiration. I would say, if it's beautiful, it comes from God. Other people would explain it in different ways. But nevertheless, if I'm not meant to be a composer, if I'm not a good composer, it doesn't matter how much music theory I understand. It can all conform to everything I create can conform to the rules, but it won't be beautiful because I don't understand how to use it. And that's the mysterious element, the inspiration. And that cuts across all of art. So because of my mathematical training, when I looked at traditional ideas of harmony and proportion and the connections with the way that the cosmos, the universe is observed and was observed by the ancients, they looked at it, you might say scientifically, but they had in a different way. It was a different scientific method. But nevertheless, they accounted for it mathematically in the way that a scientist does. They also accounted for the beauty of music mathematically, which people today would understand. And then, once I can do that, then I try to use those rules of composition, if you like, in the art that I produce. I use specific proportions. I relate different aspects of a composition to others in accordance with those theories. And this is, I know, what artists always used to do. This is something that was abandoned. The rejection of this began in the early 19th century, late 18th century, but it was complete by the Second World War, I would say. So people refused to acknowledge any of this as a principle.
I will say that it was news to me when I read you talking about the mathematics of beauty and the ideas about proportions. And I do think that this is one of the reasons why you're trying to reach a broader audience about this, because you just said that this approach to beauty and making art that's based on harmonious proportion and mathematics is not what is typically being taught in schools of art and music. When I recently spoke about some of these principles, someone actually asked me, how do you help or communicate to people who are in fine arts programs in music and art and architecture, where they actually, do they actually reject these principles? Someone said to me that they knew someone, I think it was in a fine arts painting program, and the student spoke about beauty and the professor said, no, we don't use that word here. Does that surprise you?
No. In many ways, the people who are trying to undermine what I would want to introduce, or have a very different view, understand that beauty is the sign of these traditional forms of art, and they deliberately want to reject beauty because they're rejecting tradition. Now, the arguments that might be made by them is that the sort of things that I'm talking about are a restriction on creativity and originality. These are the great things that people strive for. I would say, no, it's that there's infinite possibilities working within these constraints. They are constraints. They specify certain paths which you can take if you want your work to be beautiful, as people understood the idea in the past. But the range of possibility, even within those, is still infinite. That's the nature of mathematics. You can keep counting forever. So it's one of the sort of quandaries of mathematics that there is an infinite range. And this is true here. Now, an analogy that's often drawn is that it's a bit, does this restrict your ability to express yourself or to be creative? Well, think of when somebody wants to play the piano. This is a description that I've heard. If you might argue that teaching somebody to play piano, learning all the scales, learning how to reflect what you see on the page in the music score with your fingers, that's a very, very deep training, and that I would say that no one would argue that it's bad to learn how to play the piano. But that's effectively what people are arguing in art. So if you just sat me at a piano, I can't play the piano, and said just play it, I would just produce random notes. It's going to be ugly. Now, if I know how to play the piano, I've got the skill, I know where the accepted paths are for my fingers to go in order to produce music as composed, then that in some ways is a constraint, but many people would say that's a freedom to have that skill, to be able to play it beautifully and well is a freedom, and that what you're doing is actually giving people a language of expression that enables them to play the piano. It's like your little example earlier of going somewhere and not being able to speak the language. I could just utter gibberish and expect people to understand what I was saying. It would be better for me if I learnt the language and then I was able to talk to people. But that necessitates me to conform to certain patterns of the society of which I'm part of. But that is a freedom. I can express a multitude of ideas once I have that gift of language, and having the gift of language doesn't restrict them. It might in certain ways, depending on the language, influence it, but it is a freedom. And that's the same with the mathematics of beauty and the traditional understanding of a formation in beauty.
Well, I wanted to also just pick up a little bit on that. When I travel to other countries, all the stuff you're talking about, music and fine arts and harmony, although I can't speak the language, I often can enter into the music of a particular culture. So I'm born and raised Roman Catholic, and Roman Catholics have, at least in the typical Western Rite, which is what most people know, have a very similar liturgy around the world. So I have been to liturgies in countries where I don't understand a word of what is being said in Scripture, but I can at least hum along with the music and the hymns. And in doing so, and in looking at the images and looking at people in the eyes and bowing and making the sign of peace, I feel that through those symbols, there is a common experience that transcends the words. Now, it might be nice if I could understand the words.
Yeah.
But I've been able to participate through sharing in these forms of beauty. And I want to turn a little bit to specific artistic traditions, because a piece of your book is all that we're talking about creativity and art and, why it belongs, why there's a connection between science and creativity, and why there's a connection between creativity and a shared culture. But you do make icons. So this experience that I have had of going to a country where I don't know the history or the culture and being able to connect through the liturgy, a student here at Princeton Theological Seminary had reached out to me last semester and said, can you suggest some readings on icons? I've become really interested in them. He told me he doesn't have any symbolic background in his church tradition. The walls were pretty much bare, and they focused on a reverent reading of Scripture and a great sermon and a moral lesson. But he got interested in the visual part and was reading on icons. And he told me that after an immersive trip in Israel, when they went to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, I believe it is, that because he had studied icons, he understood the early church and what was happening in that church better than the other students in his class who had only studied Scripture and Scripture translation and church history. So why is it that someone who has studied only Scripture and church history but not the tradition of icons, why would this young man have said, I have a hunch, but what was it about studying icons that actually helped him enter into the meaning of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Israel in a way that was unique amongst his classmates from Princeton Theological Seminary?
Well, I would say that the pattern of symbolism that he's responding to is there's something innately human about it. So they're not just arbitrarily created. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't benefit from having the meaning of this symbolism pointed out to us. We certainly can, and the more that these things are explained to people, I think the better. And he had some explanation, so that's one thing that helped him. But the other aspect of this is that there is a belief that if we go to the widest sort of generalization of this, the beauty of nature speaks to us of the beauty of God, and that the beauty of nature is a sign of the one. Shall we say, it reflects the thumbprint of the one who created it, the mark of the one who creates it. And so there is a reflection of something true in that sign. It isn't just something that is arbitrarily applied without reference to what it's actually signifying. And the best symbols are those that speak of what they're trying to communicate in a natural way that allows us as human beings to pick it up. Now, one of the assumptions here is that we are made by God to see him in the beauty of nature. In other words, he made us to respond in this way. And the more that the symbolism and the beauty of the language of the liturgy and the actions of the liturgy, and then the art and music that's used, participates in that natural progression from the observer to the symbol and its beauty and then to God, the more that is built in, shall we say, to what you see in the church, the more we are likely to respond to it naturally. Now, it is in part instinctive, but like all instincts, these can be formed and directed and encouraged, and so that people can learn how to read them. You gave him a great helping hand in your class because you gave him something to start with, but then he was able to take that a little further because it was natural for him to do so. I would say also that in part it suggests to me that he's looking for God. He wants to respond. There's something in his heart that desires this. And that's something else that's important. These things are made to speak to those who are seeking what is being offered. And in many ways, you can't legislate for that. That's in him. But I think is what's happening. And the task for the artist or for the culture creator in whatever we do is to try and participate in that dynamic, to speak to those who are looking for God by participating in divine beauty, but in a way that is going to be discerned naturally.
Wow. Well, I will say that another example of teaching this here at Princeton Theological Seminary, that young man I just mentioned who went to Israel after having studied icons and was able to enter into and understand better what was happening in this church, why it was built. I had another student in my class on the Virgin Mary who, on a different iteration of it when I taught it, he said that he was really struggling with his faith and that he felt like he was losing his faith and that he might, leave the Christian faith. He was asking very good, deep theological questions. I tried to engage with him on that. But we had a class field trip to a local Byzantine church, Eastern Rite Catholic church, which the art has a kind of set of standards that make it look like an Orthodox church. A lot of icons and the way the altar is and everything. And we were supposed to be there for about a 3-hour class period. Well, we spent about an hour or so in the church, got a tour of the church from the priest, looked at the icons, discussed them, and then we went for coffee. Well, this one particular student who was struggling with his faith didn't come to the coffee. So I figured, he's a graduate student. He just got in his car and he drove home, And when I asked him, hey, sorry I didn't see you at the, discussion after the visit to the church, I guess you just went home. And he said, no, I didn't go home. He said, I couldn't get myself to leave that sanctuary. And he was just, as you were saying, as you explained, he was genuinely moved by these images. And somehow these images were drawing him to God, and he knew it. He didn't really know how, although we had studied a little bit, but his reaction was so strong that he felt that he was in the presence of God and wanted to stay. And so I think what you're describing, like, it's difficult to describe the experience someone has when encountering sacred art, right? It's difficult to capture that in words, but we're giving some stories here of how sacred art can help people reach God. But you actually say in the beginning of your book, and now we're moving now from your general theory of culture into icons and sacred art particularly. What is it that you mean by saying that beauty is the mark of a loving God? And by correlation, right, one of the discussions I have often at Princeton Theological Seminary is, what does it mean that images can help us to know God, not just with the head, but with the heart? Because for a lot of people, they've been actually taught that beauty and images distract us from God, right? So does beauty distract us from God, or can beauty draw us to God? And if it can draw us to God, are there particular kinds of beauty that do that better than others?
Yes. I would say that that beauty certainly attracts us. And now the question then, what is it attracting us to? So if we see a beautiful object, clearly in the first instance, it's attracting us to itself, that we see it, it takes our gaze, we want to look at it. Now, the traditional understanding is that the beautiful object then, after calling us to itself, it then leads us on beyond itself to God, so that we pass through it in terms of our, shall we say, our contemplation, that we see the object, and then it creates a desire for something more, and that is God. So one way, again, of relating that perhaps many people will understand who haven't experienced this in the context of church or in sacred art, but what everything in the church is trying to capture is the same experience that many people have in nature. I think there's very few people who would say that nature is by nature ugly, for example. If we see a sunset or we see nature, it's all, the two are almost synonymous. I mean, traditionally, many people put nature with a capital N. You know, it's the ideal of beauty. But it's something that you've written about in your book. You even use it in the title, The Wounds of Beauty. But this is an important thing to understand, I think, in the way that people traditionally approach that, is that when I see some beauty in nature, certainly it attracts me to it, but I know it's not enough. It creates this yearning for something more. Now, the question then is, what is it creating that yearning for? And you refer to this yearning as a wound, that in other words, that we immediately become aware of something lacking. We want the perfection of what is presented in front of us. So for some people, that might begin a quest, a never-ending quest of more and more nature, visiting far-flung places in the world. Nothing wrong with that, but I would say that's never going to satisfy this urge. When people reflected on this in the past, and many people today reflect on it, who are certainly those who are Christians, and certainly in the ancient Greek world, for example, this was prior to Christianity, this is their reaction. What they say is that it creates a yearning for an invisible standard that is the perfection of beauty. And as Christians, we would say that is God. Now, everything that's going on in the churches are trying to create that wound as much as they are to appease our senses. And our mutual friend, Father Rob Johansson, actually, a friend of ours, he put this very well. He said that beauty is both confrontational and, what was the phrase?
Invitational?
Invitational and confrontational. So it draws us in, but at the same time, it speaks of something that is greater, more perfect, and grander than us. And we can respond to that confrontation in a number of different ways. We can reject it and seek to master it, or we can humbly accept it and seek that greater being, the one who is perfect, who is God.
Well, I often, when I introduce this topic, right, I often try to get people thinking or rethinking some of the commonplace assumptions about beauty, right? That beauty is purely subjective. We've already discussed that. There are certain principles of harmony and clarity. And I try to just, using these examples like Annapolis or the campus of Princeton University, get people to see that there's actually a reason why people find the arches around Blair Arch at Princeton or East Pine or the Gothic cathedral,
Yes.
the Gothic church, find that to be, it's not just kind of subjectively pretty, you can actually see the whole and see the parts of it. Whereas with a building that's a bit more of a blob, like the architecture building, pardon me, it's not clear what it is you're looking at. Whereas
Yes.
the Gothic architecture is actually directing the eye. So it's not that the pleasure of that is purely subjective. There's an objective component to it. But still, and I'm going to push you a little bit on this, when I start saying this, right, talking about beauty and principles of beauty and beauty leading us to God, then it sounds like you're saying that there need to be standards for art. You've already clarified, I think, that what you're saying is that there are certain principles, but that ultimately those principles will further the creativity, but with a shared set of principles. Would you say that that's right? Or are you actually saying that we need strict standards for what should be in sacred art?
No, the way that this has worked in the past is not to define in fine detail, should we say, what goes in there. So the church tends to say that it should be beautiful, it should raise people to God, but then it doesn't say precisely what that means. So we're still left fishing in a way, wondering what on earth we look to. Now, I think it's worth thinking, in order to answer that question, worth thinking about what we mean when we say beauty is an objective property and there are standards that define it. Now, I think we can get close to defining principles that we see in common in all beautiful things. But then the question is, who decides what are the beautiful things that we're judging, from which we draw the principles? And how do we decide what's right? Now, you could have a set of elites who pick a canon and just choose it, and then they impose that on everybody. That, ironically, for all that people talk about sort of democracy in the world today, that tends to be the modern approach. It's the elites in the universities just tell people what is good and what is bad artistically. That isn't the way it was done traditionally. The way it was done traditionally is that people look to tradition. I mean, the very way that I talk, you can hear that I'm looking to tradition as an authority. So what am I thinking when I say that? Well, there is no, because it is absolutely, let's just take a step back, sorry, that it is certainly true that there is a subjective element when we respond to beauty. Not everybody responds in exactly the same way. And we mustn't ignore that fact. We can't just tell people that I'm asserting that this is beautiful, therefore you're wrong, because the person will just say, well, I don't agree with you. And telling me very strongly that I'm wrong doesn't persuade me. And so what we do is we look at what is the most common response to certain things, and is that response prolonged? And so when I say that nature, the natural world, is beautiful, most people will agree with me on that, not just because they personally feel it, which usually they do, but they know that many, many people think that, and furthermore have thought that over centuries. Now, when it comes to artifacts, things made by human hand, we can't say for certain that anything is beautiful. I can't prove it to you rationally, even if it, as I explained before, even if it incorporates all the mathematical functions of beauty that I described. It could be that the artist has done it badly, and so it doesn't work. How do we know, therefore, what we can point to as being beautiful? Well, the best standard we have is that many people look at it and think it's beautiful, and they have done so over a long period of time. And we call that group of people, collectively, we call that tradition. We say that we look back over centuries, and many people point to this sort of art in the liturgy as performing the job that art is expected to do in the liturgy, and those who are looking to art in the way that is appropriate in the liturgy find it beautiful. And so we look to tradition. Now, that doesn't restrict us, therefore, to simply copying the past. We let tradition be a guide. So we look at the tradition and we say, okay, what are the underlying principles in those things that we can then apply, perhaps in new ways, innovative ways, but nevertheless consistent with the tradition. And so that is why you can look at Georgian architecture and immediately say that belongs to the Georgian period, the periods of King George or the King's George in Britain, the 18th century. And we recognize it by its correspondence to a particular time period. It looked like nothing that had preceded it, and it looks like nothing that has come since. It's unique. But nevertheless, it participates in the traditional ideas of proportion and harmony. Its underlying ideas are exactly the same, in fact, as Gothic architecture, which is also beautiful and is of a particular time and a particular place. And so tradition is the thing we must respect. What is interesting is that many people who assert that beauty is bad or that it's purely subjective and doesn't matter, they tend to be anti-tradition as well.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there, but as I told you at the recent talk which I gave for the Consortium of Christian Studies Centers, when I was speaking on beauty and its connection to intellectual formation and faith formation, and arguing that beauty has an element of imagination, but it also has an element of reason and science, which we have talked about. One of the questions I got was, look, I'd like to agree with you that there's this objective quality to beauty, but a lot of people just look at something I think is beautiful and they don't agree, right? So how do you then respond to that? How would you educate someone to see something as beautiful? And so I sort of said, look, and I don't know if you agree with me here, David, but I said, part of the reason I do the work I do is because I do think we live in an era of visual noise, right? Think of Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death, or, Matthew Crawford's The World Outside of Your Head. We live in an era of kind of hyper-stimulation of images and sounds. And a lot of people working in education, working with young people, acknowledge that something's not right. It's either too many images, the wrong kind of images, music in earbuds on all the time, or the wrong kinds of music. So people are willing to make a judgment that there's something wrong with our visual culture and auditory culture, too much, the wrong kind, etc. But they don't necessarily know what to propose is right. And so what I think that you're trying to do here, what I like about what you're trying to do, and what I think together we're trying to do with Scala, is communicate some of these principles. Not to, as you say, not to tell people exactly what to create, but to tell them that there are principles of beauty which resonate with the human person and create beautiful form. What I've tried to do, and again, this is getting back to this question of how do you educate people to perceive this kind of beauty? Some of the examples I gave is I said, listen, this understanding of beauty is going to be new to a lot of people because a lot of people believe that there's no difference between beauty and kitsch, kind of an excessive emotional artist expressing their sentiment. That's what makes it beautiful, is that the artist thinks it is, right? Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And if beauty is in the eye of the beholder, then, kind of there are no standards at all. Anything can be beautiful. And nothing in art is bad. But that doesn't go with these experiences that you and I have talked about. And in fact, most people, if you actually ask them questions, will not really think anything goes in beauty. But some of the examples I gave for people working in education, I just said, well, when I had a Christmas party at my house, 2 Christmas parties, one for friends and I had one for students. Well, you know what I did? I framed one of your icons of the Blessed Mother and Jesus, because what is Christmas about? The baby Jesus. So I framed it. And I gave it to everybody who came. I gave out like 50 of those. And many people have told me that they put it on their desk or they put it in their house. So I said to people who, look, if you don't have a tradition of icons in your church tradition, or these principles of beauty sound strange, you know what? Pick up a sacred icon, put it in your office, look at it, ponder it, and let it work on you over time, right? Because I think that although sometimes there are these really strong instinctive reactions to beauty, a lot of times beautiful music and beautiful art just takes time to penetrate. It's not screaming at you, right? It's not kind of forcing you to give a particular answer. It's an invitation. It's a confrontation, as we said, but it's an invitation. So that was a long way of asking you a question and answering it myself, which is a very common thing in my family and sometimes in our household discussions. But if I could give you a chance to answer the question that I just answered for myself, how do you respond to people who say, look, people don't agree with me with what's beautiful, and how would I educate somebody to believe that a certain painting is beautiful when they just don't think it is?
Well, first of all, what I would say is grant people the possibility that they might be right and I might be wrong. If I pick out any particular painting, I can't prove to you that it's good or bad. What I would say is that try to consider whether or not this has passed the test of time. So if I think of, for example, Velázquez's beautiful painting of the crucifixion, it just has Christ on the cross. It was painted in the 17th century, so in Spain in the 1600s. If we look at that, as you say, over time, we may change our opinion about it, because the very nature of beauty is that it is, as you said, invitational and confrontational. And we may resent the message that this tells us of our place in relation to God. And so perhaps we need to contemplate this, to think about it, and we need to be changed ourselves. And beauty has this effect. It transforms us as we think about what we're confronted with when we look at it. But ultimately, I can't prove to you whether something is beautiful or not. There is no grand arbiter of beauty. There are no 10 commandments of beauty that we can check boxes and prove to you that I'm right and you're wrong. We can't do that. What I would say is that if, on the whole, when you go to Oxford or something, we're about to take a trip to Oxford. I think it's one of the most beautiful cities around. I'm biased, I love the place. But I think there are 10 million visitors a year who go to Oxford. Now, on the whole, they go as tourists to the buildings in the centre. I gave my game away there. To the buildings in the centre. Why do they go there? Why do they look at those? Well, if you ask them, they say because of their beauty. There are many other buildings in Oxford. It's a city. There are new buildings on the outskirts. Why don't 10 million people visit those? And the answer is because they don't find them beautiful. Now, it might be that 10 million people a year are wrong. That's possible. But I think I have trust in human nature and the general consensus, actually. I have more belief and faith in the common human opinion on this. And I would say that on the whole, if many people find it beautiful over a long period of time, the chances are that it is. Now, when confronted with something that is painted today, it's always possible to assert that it's beautiful. I find it beautiful. I don't care if anyone else agrees with me. That's the opinion I'm going to hold to. And I would say, well, you might be right and we might be wrong. I can't prove to you which is which, but time will tell. Now, in terms of what I choose in my home, I can pick anything I like. You're free to pick anything you like. I'm not going to tell you what you should have. But when it comes to what we have in a church, where the reason that we have churches is to draw people to God, I would say there that the art that is chosen we should be much more conservative. We should be much more traditional, because that's safer, that we're picking things that we know that it's more likely that the art they see is actually drawing people to God, because time has told us through tradition that it has done so for many people over a long period of time. And that therefore, if I go into a church that has traditional forms of art and I see more confrontation than invitation, that's probably my problem. It's probably something in me and my personal response that I need to look at rather than the art.
Well, I want to also just give you a little bit of a chance. I think we're kind of thinking here about these standards in art and their place in worship. And I wanted to give you a chance to tell us a little bit about another book, which I understand you're working on. And it has to do with this last point you made, that although there's a lot of creativity and leeway for people to create things, to debate what is beautiful, when it comes to places of worship, because of the importance of worship and because of the power of beauty to draw us to God, and I would say, also, getting back to my earlier point, the power of some forms of art or music to distract us from God.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right? So, I mean, I, for one, I love, Steve Perry from Journey, but that's not the music I want at my funeral, It's pleasurable, but it's not appropriate for worship. Similarly, with art, not everything is appropriate for worship. So what I hear you saying is not that there's a canon of images and nothing new can be made and we have to stick with what was done in the first 200 or 400 years or the first 700. No, it's not what I hear you saying. What I hear you saying is that we want there to be a revival of people making sacred art, and there might very well be new forms and new kinds of art that come out of that, but we need to go slowly before we say something fits with the tradition. And in the meantime, we should look at the churches we have now and ask, can those churches be brought more in line with traditional forms of sacred art? So
Yes.
What is this book on art for the sacred feasts of the church that you're working on? And why are you doing that book?
Well, I should say in the first instance, I should give credit where credit's due. It's because my teacher and friend, and someone you know well as well, Aidan Hart, has just produced a book that is wonderful. It's called Festal Icons, and it's for the Byzantine churches. He's Orthodox, and it lists the main feasts in the church year and the standard images in the Orthodox Church, and it's in iconographic style for those feasts. It explains the symbolism, it explains the meaning of the feast. So then what happens is that the images that you see in the church on that day, they would bring out an icon and put it at the front of the church for you to see and contemplate specifically on the feast day. It relates to the feast being celebrated. So the content and the symbolism within it are appropriate to the feast, they reflect it, but also the style. Experience has shown us that it speaks to us not just superficially through the emotions. Superficial is good, but it's not the best, shall we say. I always think superficialness is underrated, but that can be there too. But at the same time, it must speak to our reason and to our hearts, to the deepest place within us that draws all of these human faculties together. And that's what these icons are designed to do. So there's the invitation, there's the confrontation in the stylistic elements, that then when we contemplate them, we actually overcome the confrontation and we move to God. So experience has shown that this content and this style works well with the Byzantine liturgies and the Orthodox Church. So for Eastern Rite Catholics, that's perfect. You can go straight to Aidan's book. We don't have an equivalent in the Roman Rite in the Catholic Church. In the past, this didn't matter because everybody just followed tradition. They just did what people had done beforehand. They didn't question it. And so they knew what the images for the feasts looked like, because they just, broadly speaking, conformed to what people had done. They might innovate here and there, but always without breaking away from tradition. We're now in a place where we're completely separated from tradition artistically. Nobody is aware of what the images are, what the content is, and then furthermore, stylistically, we're in terms of art, what tends to be asserted is anything goes. You can do whatever you like. And so I thought it would be great to have an equivalent of what Aidan has done for the Roman Rite. So the three of us, that's me and you, and then Father Rob Johansson, who we mentioned earlier, who is a liturgist, he's an expert in the liturgy, are coming up with, we're trying to produce a book which will have something like 20 images that do what Aidan has done. They reach into the tradition, and now we're thinking of the Western tradition. Much of it is very similar, I would say, to the Eastern. That we don't need to vary very much for the most part, but there are certain things like the Sacred Heart, for example, is a Western feast. It's in the Roman Rite, it's not in the Eastern. So we need to draw on tradition slightly more creatively in that sense. We're looking at images prior to the Sacred Heart that seem to emphasize the incarnation and this sort of thing. But the goal here is to produce something that might be a template for artists today to produce art for the Roman Rite. So the content will be explained. There'll be line drawings and colour plates. For the artists who want to produce their own art, they might decide they want to base it on the line drawings that we give. The reason I know that that's useful is that as an artist, it's always easier to start with a line drawing and modify that and adapt that than it is the colour plates. It will also act as a teaching tool, incidentally, because it's great for kids to colour in a line drawing. And I've decided to use an iconographic style for this, slightly modified so that it speaks to people in the Roman Rite in the West. But again, you've got to start somewhere, so I felt that was the best way of doing it. We're doing this because there really is no equivalent. If somebody wants to commission art for a church today, very often they don't know what art is appropriate for the liturgy, how to engage with it in the liturgy, in the course of our worship. I don't mean simply devotionally, prayers before the Mass, say, when we light a candle, which is very good, but ultimately we're trying to engage with this in the course of our worship. This is barely done in the Roman Rite today, unfortunately. So we're trying to re-establish that practice of engaging with art and reconnect ourselves with the traditions so that it's a starting point. Now, we're not going to claim dogmatic authority, should we say, or church dogma as an authority here. We're looking to tradition, and if somebody else were to do this project, there might be things that they would do differently. To a certain degree, we have to make choices in looking at the array of art in the past as to what we draw from. But at least it's a starting point. In the absence of anything else, we hope that people might look to it and be guided by it.
Well, I do look forward to working on this book with you, and I will just say, having seen you do some of these drawings at home, I've seen these principles you're talking about in action. You start with a blank piece of paper, and then you take these different rulers and you kind of grid the whole thing. Then you have your drawings of some of the animals over there, and you try to figure out where they go on the grid. And so I've seen these images for this new book coming together. We had an art show at our house as part of the Scala's Art, Sacred, and the Common Good conference. We had, I think, over 100 people looking at these drawings that are in process. And I think it was really exciting to see the process of making art. And as you mentioned, you and I will be heading to Oxford very soon. I look forward to more of these kinds of conversations because my thinking has really gone in this direction of understanding how are we going to renew culture? All these things I care about, the distractions and the fragmentation, and maybe what can be called a hindered imagination. How do we take this art and these principles and translate it into a way of life, a beautiful way of life that shapes a graced imagination, where people can connect the beauty in nature to the symbols in scripture, to the liturgy, and then back into their daily lives and their vocations. I mean, this is a kind of a calling. It's an exciting adventure, but it does take effort. So when people say, well, people don't always think that what I think is beautiful, as you said, we could grant, maybe they're right, maybe it's not beautiful, but it might actually take some effort to get back to a beautiful culture and back to having beautiful churches. So to be willing to admit that, hey, look, some architecture and some art we did, it's really time to move on. Let's just let that go. And let's bring back some of these other forms, but in a way that I think you're saying, you're trying to propose this with your book on sacred feasts. And also with this book on the transformation of American culture, these two books you're working on. Again, my thinking has gone in this direction of understanding what is this experience. It's very difficult to talk about this, but what is this experience these students of mine have told me that they've had when experiencing sacred art, where they feel the presence of God? How does that form them personally? How does that form their judgment? So I'm trying to think of religious experience like that, not simply as a moment in time, but as a direct experience of God, which then has to be thought about and reflected on and connected to virtue and to moral formation. And so my project while I'm in Oxford is going to be looking a little bit about the history of devotion to Mary and its expression in popular religion and pilgrimage, but within popular religion and pilgrimage, trying to think of the personal experience of faith as actually being necessarily connected to this incredible tradition that we've been talking about. Because so often, I think this is kind of a modern way of thinking, well, my experience is my experience, and I don't have a tradition. I live outside of a tradition. I don't need a tradition. But what you've been saying is that, like it or not, when you land in America, you're not in Japan. You are born into a particular tradition that has a material form, and that form is impacting you somehow, whether you're consciously aware of that or not. So this is my interest in kind of connecting these kind of deep questions of the nature of the human person, the nature of human freedom, to how we live. And I have simply seen so many examples of young people who are maybe questioning their faith or maybe don't know who they are, but they're drawn to this traditional kind of beauty, and they're drawn on these pilgrimages. And in this time where people aren't really into traditional motherhood, they're drawn to this traditional woman, the Virgin Mary, who is a mother. And so how am I going to pull all this together? Well, if you want to know, I would suggest that you look on Scala's blog, where you can read updates on David's book as well as on my research in Oxford. Check out Scala Foundation's YouTube channel and look for more of these kinds of conversations. As David and I progress on these projects, the various books and projects, we want to bring you updates, and we want to engage people to come along with us in this journey. We would love to hear from you, what your reactions are, your interests. I would absolutely encourage you to look at some of David's past books. In particular, The Little Oratory is something of a bestseller. It has sold more than 20,000 copies, which I like to say is more than all of my academic books combined. My hunch is that David's book, The Little Oratory, is his bestseller because it has his art in it. And you can rip out the art, it's perforated, rip it out neatly, put it in frames, and have it in your home. It makes a great gift. That's why I think this book sells. People want this kind of beautiful art. So I'm happy that David is making another book that's going to have beautiful art that'll help art teachers, it'll help young children, and it'll help priests as well as patrons of the arts. And ultimately, I think I'm grateful to David for sharing with me, as he has with you today, why he's optimistic about a revival of American culture and a revival of the iconographic tradition and the traditions of sacred art, while also, I think, being clear that this revival certainly has to draw on tradition, but that tradition is open to development into new forms that we can see. So I look forward to seeing this renaissance, this revival of tradition, as well as the new forms that come out of that. And I'm grateful to David for taking the time to write these books and to make this art and to share his vision with us today. Thank you for joining us here in the studios at Princeton Theological Seminary, and look forward to seeing you on another video.